Hi everyone, I'm the Rambling Photon, and today I'd like to talk about Berkeley, the Berkeley riots, and nonviolence and the tactical use of nonviolence. So I studied nonviolence in college, and the base philosophy is pretty much that it's wrong to be violent against another person. Um, and I don't completely agree. I am somewhat of a libertarian, so I think that the initiation of violence against others is wrong. But I do not rule out the retaliation with violence. If somebody attacks you, I think that you're allowed to respond in kind. Now, that is a different discussion than tactically whether it is useful to use nonviolence. Now, I bring up Berkeley because this is sort of the first major case where you have violence narratives going in both directions. And I bring it up because one of the reasons why nonviolence is useful as a tactic is because fundamentally what the issue is and what the goal of a movement is to win the hearts and minds of the fellow citizens. And violence is not necessarily the way to do that. So the thing is, when you're talking about winning the hearts and minds, it is not a battle for land or territory. It's not a battle for physical stuff. In the same way, what it is you're trying to convince the majority of your fellow citizens and your neighbors, basically, that your side, your ideas are correct and that they should agree with you because your values are more in line with theirs than your opponents. Now, when you use violence, the problem with it in a civilized context is that it's very, very easy to lose the hearts and minds of people. It turns out that violence is actually not as hardwired into us as you might think. So there are a number of studies and a decent amount of data that suggest that people are not, or the number of people who are willing to be violent against another group of people is actually relatively limited. And by violent, I mean like to the point of murder, or of homicide, I should say. So they found in the military, and by they I mean a military psychologist named Grossman, who wrote some books on war and on killing. He has some very interesting, thought-provoking material that he covers. And one of the things he talks about is how in wars, so he, being a military psychologist, he looks at military interests. So when you look at soldiers in war, it's actually, until relatively recently, so until Vietnam, it was relatively rare for a person to actually pull the trigger against the enemy. It's something like only 10% of people would actually do that. And it turns out that the human propensity for violence is not as big as you might expect, at least to that level. So, beatings and sort of low-level violence might be relatively common, but getting to the point where you're actually killing another person is fairly rare. And when you think about that, that means what you need to do is you need to get the less violent portions of the society to, if nothing else, support your violence. If you want to be the one using violence and winning. If you are in the minority and you don't have the support and you start using violence, it's very likely that you're going to cause a backlash against you and justify more violence against you rather than being able to justify the violence against your opponent. So one of the tactical reasons why nonviolence is good, or can be good, it can be a useful tool, is during that battle for the hearts and minds. What you need to do is you need to get the majority of people on your side to act as your support, or to be able to act as your support, so that when you start responding with violence, even if the narrative is turned on you, the majority of people will be on your side. Now, so in the case of the Berkeley protests, so the first Berkeley protests of Milo Yiannopoulos, it was a very one-sided narrative. You could sort of tell, even the people who were against Milo had a very, very difficult time justifying the actions of the protesters. They weren't able to support them in any significant way. They had to resort to just name-calling and smearing of Milo as a Nazi. And then it was like, okay, well, so even if he was, do you support the violent actions? And the answer was pretty much always no. That otherwise they wouldn't be making excuses like, oh, well, those protesters weren't students, or, oh, those protesters weren't our people. They might have been your people. It might have been a false flag, that sort of thing. So when that's the spin that has to be put on it, it means that you are more likely to win others to be sympathetic to you, and that's a good thing. You want, in a culture war, you want the majority of the culture to be on your side. Now, once you start responding with violence, the narrative can be spun in either way, and that's part of the problem. So, because you can selectively edit any encounter, you can make it look like violence from any side was justified by choosing the time so that it looks like the opposing side threw the first punch. Now, if you practice nonviolence, it's impossible to do that because no one on your side is throwing punches. If no one on your side is throwing punches, you can't. It becomes much more difficult to justify the force used against them, and that's sort of a cultural theme, at least today. Now, that's not going to work, and it's not going to work against people who either pervert that cultural aspect. So the social justice sort of conception of the microaggression, having words be aggression, that's sort of a perversion of that cultural aspect. So they speak, the act of your speaking is violence, so I can respond with violence. That's sort of one perversion. Another is if you can set up the cultural narrative so far to the point where you portray your opposing side as basically a giant conspiracy that is working to oppress you in some way. So this is sort of what you'll see in the cultural narrative of the patriarchy. This sort of we've been oppressed, and so we've been oppressed for so long that we're justified in using violence to try and escape that oppression. And that sort of that issue, once you start perverting the cultural values of saying, well, violence is not okay to initiate, well, guess what? That only works against people who are buying into that narrative. One of the ways to wake people up to that narrative is by simultaneously showing that you're not what they say you are, and showing that they are worse than you. And so to do that, you can use nonviolent tactics because that demonstrates basically your moral superiority. And that's sort of the ideal. And it also prevents, because it prevents this sort of confirmation bias of, oh, well, I'm going to select people from your side being violent and stupid and evil. If they can't pick out those cases, it becomes a lot harder to paint you as an oppressor or some sort of villain. And it becomes very easy for you to paint the other side as being oppressive villains. And this is something that I've seen to a degree from the two sides that are trying to spin this. So from my left-wing friends on Facebook, I've seen the Berkeley protest that just happened, the second set, in this latest spat, were clashes with Trump supporters or white supremacists or Nazis or whatever, right? And then from the native Kekistani, and I sort of count myself as kind of a native Kekistani. I'm a bit too much of a lurker, though. The spin is that, the protesters were obviously defending themselves. Now, while I agree with the second narrative, I do think that a lot of the protesters were defending themselves. The fact is that the media can portray them as being aggressors, and that is a problem, tactically speaking. It becomes more difficult to invite people who don't understand the full context of the situation when they're being introduced to the free speech groups as, oh, well, they support Nazis and they're violent. That becomes a lot harder to defend than they're not violent and they support Nazis' rights to speak or white supremacists' right to speak. And so it becomes more difficult. And I guess I'm interested to see how this plays out because the culture war, it never ends. And I think we're sort of we're seeing a swing. The tide has turned a little bit from the left to the right now, and we'll see how it ends up going. And I don't know. It's one of those things that I hope it doesn't. I hope the violence doesn't escalate, because if it does, that's not going to be a pleasant time to live in. Anyway, those are some of my thoughts on Berkeley and nonviolence, and the use of violence, and when nonviolence might be better than violence as a tactic. I'm the Rambling Photon, and hope to catch you next time.